What if the most powerful man in Europe's underworld wasn't sitting in a boardroom or hiding in a prison cell, but living quietly under the sun in Turkey while his influence stretched across borders he no longer crossed? Long before his name became a warning, whispers followed him through brothels, biker bars, and entire red light districts. Some called him a mastermind, others a ghost. Yet everyone agreed on one thing: Necati Arabaci was the kind of criminal you only underestimate once.
Dostlarımızla oturuyoruz. Bundan sonra da her zaman dostlarımızla beraberiz.
Born in the shadows, the making of a Cologne underworld prince, Necati Arabaci did not grow up in a world built for softness. Born on February 14, 1972, in Cologne, Germany, he entered a city divided between opportunity and survival. His parents, Turkish immigrants searching for stability, found themselves navigating a society where newcomers often lived in the cracks. Those cracks were precisely where young Necati learned to adapt. While other children followed predictable paths through school and apprenticeships, he studied a different education, one shaped by the streets, nightlife, and quiet observation of power. Cologne in the 1980s and early 90s was a city pulsing with contradictions. Its vibrant nightlife masked a growing criminal infrastructure, and anyone willing to act without hesitation could claim a piece of it. Necati understood early that influence didn't come from wealth or reputation. It came from presence, knowing how to read a room, how to intimidate without threats, and most importantly, how to control environments where the law rarely stepped in. The nightclub scene was full of such environments. As a young man working as a bouncer, he found the perfect training ground. It was where he learned the hierarchy of violence, the subtleties of body language, and the unspoken rules between criminal groups who shared the same territory. Bouncers did more than check IDs. They enforced order on behalf of owners, gang associates, and sometimes the unseen figures whose profits depended on stability. Necati's toughness made him noticeable. His reliability made him valuable. By his early 20s, he wasn't just a bouncer, he was managing them. This shift marked the beginning of his transformation. Managing bouncers meant managing doors, and managing doors meant controlling access to the city's most profitable ecosystem, the red light district. Cologne's red light areas were a maze of brothels, gambling dens, and unlicensed clubs. They operated legally on the surface, but thrived through arrangements that were anything but legal. Whoever controlled the security controlled the income, and whoever controlled the income controlled the streets. By 1999, Necati had become more than a figure in the nightlife. He was a gatekeeper. His operations expanded across Cologne and into nearby towns, using trusted frontmen to maintain distance between himself and the businesses generating cash. His brothel networks from Babylon in Elsdorf to houses in Luston and Mallorca weren't just profitable. They were proof that he understood the one principle that governed the underworld. Control must be invisible. His rise attracted attention from the people who mattered most in this world, the Hells Angels. Their presence in Germany was strong, their reputation stronger, and Necati's growing influence offered them something useful. He provided territory, income, and intimidation. They provided structure, protection, and brand power. It was a mutually beneficial connection at first, but over time, the relationship shifted. Necati wasn't merely working with them, he was becoming essential to them. The Hells Angels machine, understanding the power structure he entered. To understand the gravity of Necati Arabaci's rise, one must first understand the world he strategically stepped into. The Hells Angels Motorcycle Club is often portrayed as a group of rugged bikers riding Harleys across open highways, but that image barely scratches the surface. Behind the leather vests and roaring engines lies a global criminal infrastructure built on hierarchy, discipline, and a reputation so intimidating that it often replaces physical violence. When Necati aligned with them, he wasn't joining a club. He was entering an international machine. The Angels operate across more than 60 countries with thousands of fully patched members. But each chapter functions like a miniature kingdom with its own territory, rules, and leadership. In Germany alone, over 600 members enforce order in cities where nightlife and organized crime intersect almost seamlessly. Their structure is rigid presidents, vice presidents, and sergeants-at-arms ensuring the club's power remains absolute. This system creates consistency, predictability, and coordinated violence when required. But power inside the Hells Angels is not democratic. It is earned through loyalty, resilience, criminal contribution, and a willingness to protect the club at any cost. Membership is not given lightly. Prospects must prove themselves through years of service, demonstrating unquestioned obedience and usefulness. And once patched, they become bound by a code that values secrecy above all else. The Angels' strength lies in this code, a silent contract that binds men together long after public alliances crumble. For Necati, this structure provided something he previously lacked: an army. His influence in Cologne's red light district had earned him respect, but respect alone could not secure expansion. The Hells Angels offered muscle, brand intimidation, and an international network capable of moving drugs, weapons, and money across borders with frightening efficiency. In return, they gained someone who understood business, negotiation, and control on a scale rarely seen in the underworld. The Angels' involvement in Germany was far deeper than motorcycle culture. They dominated brothels, security companies, drug distribution routes, and extortion rings. Their rivalries with gangs like the Bandidos, Satudara, and United Tribunes created perpetual tension, shaping the criminal landscape of entire cities. These rivalries weren't petty conflicts. They were battles for territory worth millions. Every inch of pavement mattered, and every nightclub door represented revenue. In such an environment, Necati's intelligence stood out. He understood how to profit without triggering unnecessary wars. He knew which alliances to maintain, which enemies to marginalize, and which conflicts to avoid entirely. The Angels recognized this. They valued individuals who could expand their influence while minimizing heat from law enforcement. Necati provided both benefits, and in return, he gained the one thing every criminal in Europe feared losing: protection. Cologne's Red Light Kingdom: how Arabaci built an empire from the shadows. Cologne's red light district has always been a world within a world, neon lights hiding darker exchanges, security teams acting as gatekeepers, and fortunes changing hands in the span of a night. For most men, it was a place to spend money. For criminals, it was a place to earn it. But for Necati Arabaci, it became something much larger. The foundation of an empire built on control, fear, and absolute precision. By the late 1990s, Cologne's nightlife was evolving into a thriving ecosystem where brothels, bars, and underground clubs competed for dominance. Security companies managed the doors, owners managed the entertainment, and the underworld managed everything else. Necati understood early that whoever controlled the security controlled the flow of business. Whoever controlled the business controlled the district. This realization transformed him from a simple bouncer into an architect of power. His rise began quietly. He didn't storm into brothels with threats or visible force. Instead, he replaced weak links in the system with loyal men, placed managers who owed him favors, and embedded his influence in every decision. The Babylon brothel in Elsdorf became one of his strongest bases, generating steady profit and cementing his presence in the region. From there, he expanded into additional locations: Lunen, Mallorca, Albury, each run through carefully chosen frontmen to keep his own name hidden from official ownership records. Control, not visibility, was his strategy. He avoided unnecessary attention, preferring to pull strings from the background. Club owners learned quickly that partnering with him brought order and protection. Rivals learned just as quickly that challenging him brought consequences. Necati's reputation grew not because he sought notoriety, but because he created a system that ran more efficiently than any of his competitors. Violence was used only when necessary. Influence did the rest. But dominance in the red light district required more than muscle. It required alliances. Necati's connection to the Hells Angels provided a protective shield no ordinary gang could match. Their insignia alone deterred intrusions. Their presence discouraged rivals. Their network allowed him to manage operations far beyond Cologne's borders. And while many saw the Angels as his enforcers, the relationship was more balanced than most realized. Necati brought them access to profitable territories. They brought him legitimacy in the underworld hierarchy. Operation Cologne. The police turned their eyes toward a ghost. By the early 2000s, Necati Arabaci's empire was no longer a rumor whispered among gangland circles. It was a measurable force shaping the criminal economy of Cologne. And in Germany, the power of that scale never goes unnoticed. Law enforcement had been watching him for years, tracking his movements through the red light district, observing the men who surrounded him and dissecting the businesses that quietly fed money into his network. But bringing him down required more than suspicion. It required patience, precision, and a task force willing to hunt a man who moved like a shadow. Chief Prosecutor Jürgen Rother was the first to articulate what many investigators already knew. Arabaci wasn't a small-time organizer. He wasn't a club enforcer or a violent street figure. He was something far more dangerous, a strategist operating behind layers of loyal intermediaries, protected by a reputation that made witnesses disappear before they ever stepped into a courthouse. Most criminals leave a trail. Necati left silence. That silence forced German authorities to rethink their approach. Traditional raids and interrogations wouldn't work. Surveillance had to be deeper, undercover work had to be meticulous, and the evidence they could gather had to be overwhelming enough to withstand both legal scrutiny and the intimidation tactics that often followed investigations into the Hells Angels. By 2002, a special task force was assembled specifically to dismantle Arabaci's operations. They focused not on him directly, but on the infrastructure he relied on. Every brothel, every bouncer gang, every property connected to him through shell owners became part of the investigation. Slowly, the puzzle began taking shape. Witnesses who had been too afraid to speak before started to surface. Financial records revealed suspicious flows of cash. Surveillance logs showed connections between his operations and known Hells Angels members, confirming what authorities had long suspected, that his power came from more than street influence. As the task force tightened its net, the scale of his criminal enterprise became clearer. Human trafficking routes tied back to his brothels, organized extortion rackets linked to his security teams. Armed robberies were carried out by his associates. Everything pointed to one conclusion. This wasn't a local criminal figure. This was a man running a multinational network of profit and violence. The arrest finally came in 2002. It was calculated, swift, and designed to prevent any chance of escape or retaliation. When officers stormed the location, they didn't just see a man. They saw the architect of one of the most sophisticated criminal systems Cologne had ever confronted. The charges reflected that scale: leading a criminal organization, extortion, human trafficking, aggravated assault, and armed robbery. Power behind bars: how Arabaci turned prison into a command center. For many criminals, prison is the end of the story, a place where influence fades and empires collapse under the weight of isolation. But for Necati Arabaci, imprisonment became something entirely different. A temporary inconvenience, a pause in movement, not a power pause. The day he entered his cell in 2002, investigators expected to see a man finally stripped of his empire. Instead, they watched something far more unsettling: the empire adjusting itself to keep flowing through him. German authorities quickly realized that Arabaci didn't need to walk free to remain dangerous. His network existed outside the walls, built on loyalty, fear, and financial dependency. The brothels he had established didn't close. The bouncer crews didn't collapse. The Hells Angels members aligned with him didn't distance themselves. Instead, they continued operating as if their leader was simply managing them from a different office. For a man who had built a career on invisibility, prison merely gave him a quieter headquarters. Inside, he observed the same principles he had applied on the streets: maintain discipline, build alliances, control information. Inmates respected him not because of threats, but because of his reputation. Guards watched him closely, but even surveillance had limits. Every visitor, every message, every subtle gesture became a conduit for maintaining order. Even the brothel in Albury, one of his most profitable operations, continued functioning, reportedly under his direction. Police monitoring his meetings and phone calls found traces of communication that connected him back to his businesses, proving that physical confinement did little to sever his authority. But what truly shocked investigators was not that he maintained influence, but how far he was willing to go to protect it. The assassination plot against Chief Prosecutor Jürgen Reuter emerged from routine monitoring within the prison. Conversations whispered in a visitor room, coded exchanges and indirect references painted a picture of a dangerous blueprint. Authorities pieced together enough to conclude that Arabaci had allegedly arranged for an Albanian hitman from Duisburg to eliminate the very prosecutor who had orchestrated his arrest. Exile or upgrade, Arabaci's rebirth in Turkey. When German authorities deported Necati Arabaci in 2007, they believed they were removing a threat from their soil. They imagined a man isolated, cut off from his network, stripped of the infrastructure that had fueled his criminal ascent. But for Arabaci, Turkey was not exile. It was an opportunity, a new landscape, a new layer of protection, and a new strategic position from which he could rebuild with even greater reach. Turkey welcomed him not as a fugitive, but as a citizen shielded by laws that forbade extradition. The same legal barrier meant to protect ordinary citizens effectively granted him immunity from the European authorities, who still wanted him behind bars. Instead of returning to a modest life, he settled in Izmir city with deep ports, international connections, and a thriving underworld of its own. For someone with Arabaci's instincts, it was the perfect launchpad. His first move was not flashy, it was precise. He strengthened ties with the Hells Angels Nomads Turkey chapter, a group uniquely positioned to operate across borders without being bound by territory. Nomads were the elite, the enforcers, the silent operators who could move from Germany to the Balkans to the Middle East without raising the suspicions that regular members might. Aligning himself with them was not only strategic, it was transformational. From Turkey, he cultivated what investigators later described as a long-distance criminal command center. He no longer needed to stand at the door of a Cologne nightclub to assert authority. His influence now moved through encrypted messages, loyal intermediaries, and financial networks that carried cash far more discreetly than physical presence ever could. Brothels in Germany continued to operate, middlemen collected revenue, trusted associates maintained control of the red light district that had once been his personal kingdom. Meanwhile, Turkey provided him with a unique advantage: geographical access. Positioned at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, it became the ideal staging ground for larger, more profitable operations. Reports soon connected him to narcotics trafficking routes, particularly heroin smuggling from Turkey and the Balkans into Western Europe. The drug flow was efficient, brutal, and lucrative, attributes that fit seamlessly into his existing empire. European investigators began noticing a pattern. Arrests in Germany and Spain linked back to associates who communicated indirectly with Arabaci. Financial activity in brothels showed continued profit extraction. Rival gangs reported that he still influenced territorial decisions despite being hundreds of miles away. In their eyes, deportation had not ended his reign. It had allowed him to expand it without legal risk. Even more remarkable was his ability to maintain loyalty across borders. Criminal empires often crumble when leaders relocate, but Arabaci had something his rivals lacked: absolute fear and absolute respect. Those who worked under him in Cologne remained loyal, not because of force, but because his leadership style rewarded obedience and punished betrayal swiftly. His absence did not weaken the chain of command, it solidified it. The Silent Kingmaker, Arabaci's shadow role in European Hells Angels. By the early 2000s, something unusual began to stir within the European branches of the Hells Angels across Germany, Spain, and the Netherlands. Names that once signified stability men who had shaped the organization for decades were suddenly absent from the criminal landscape. Yet amid that chaos, investigators noticed something even more unsettling. A man hundreds of miles away, living quietly under the protection of Turkish law, appeared to be gaining influence without ever setting foot back into Europe. Necati Arabaci was no longer just a former Cologne boss or a Turkish-based exile. He was behaving like a strategist, a coordinator, a shadow kingmaker shaping decisions from afar. And the more European authorities observed, the more they realized that the criminal ecosystem had begun to orbit around him again. The turning point came after the arrest of Frank Hanbuth, one of the most powerful Hells Angels in Europe and the longtime chairman of the Hanover chapter. Hanbuth's influence had extended beyond Germany into Spain's high-end nightlife and the club's broader European strategy. When he was detained during Spain's Operation Casablanca, a sudden leadership void emerged. Several internal factions quietly positioned themselves to fill it, but none had the longevity, the international network, or the instinctive authority that Arabaci possessed. He didn't need to campaign for power. He didn't need to appear at meetings. His name alone shifted conversations. Authorities in Germany, Spain, and Denmark began following financial trails that pointed back to him. These weren't direct links. They were patterns, movements of money, transfers of assets, territorial decisions that aligned perfectly with his long-standing business networks. Associates who had once worked under him in Cologne suddenly appeared in decision-making roles across Europe. Clubs that had previously clashed with him began showing signs of quiet alignment. It was as if Arabaci had woven threads across the continent years earlier, and now those threads were pulling the organization toward him naturally. His advantage was simple, yet powerful: geography. Operating from Turkey placed him beyond the reach of European extradition while still keeping him close enough to influence the flow of narcotics, trafficking routes, and the red light economies. Turkey sat at the gateway between heroin-producing regions and Western European markets. Anyone controlling even a fraction of that pipeline automatically held leverage over every biker chapter reliant on drug revenue. Meanwhile, Arabaci maintained a deliberately low public profile. No flashy cars, no crowded nightlife appearances, no visible displays of wealth. His silence became part of his strength. Police could not track him through social patterns. Rivals could not predict his moves. Allies could not betray him without exposing themselves. War and diplomacy, Arabaci's conflicts, alliances, and the shifting map of Europe. As Necati Arabaci's name began circulating through the undercurrents of Europe's criminal landscape, he found himself entangled in an environment where alliances were temporary tools and rivalries demanded constant calibration. His rise had already disrupted Cologne's balance years earlier, but from Turkey, his influence radiated outward, reshaping the relationships between some of Europe's most volatile biker gangs and criminal networks. To understand how Arabaci navigated this shifting landscape, one must first recognize the nature of biker politics. Violence is a language, but alliances are the grammar that allows empires to grow. Every territory, every street, every nightclub carries a history written by those who fought to control it. European biker culture is fragmented by national boundaries, shaped by local histories, and driven by group identities. Yet Arabaci managed to operate above all of these divisions. He worked like a strategist who saw countries not as borders, but as zones of influence. His earliest conflicts began in Germany in the 2009s, when tensions between the Hells Angels and the Satudara motorcycle club erupted. Satudara, a multi-ethnic and aggressively expanding Dutch-born club, had pushed into German territories, threatening long-standing control points the Hells Angels considered untouchable. Many leaders responded with force. Arabaci, however, understood that confrontation would only escalate matters and draw intense police pressure. Instead, he endorsed selective alliances and indirect pressure. Reports later suggested that he supported cooperation with groups such as the United Tribunes, a fast-growing Balkan-influenced gang with a reputation for discipline and brutality. This alignment allowed the Hells Angels to buffer their conflicts without exposing themselves to unnecessary risk. It also strengthened Arabaci's own network by giving him influence over groups operating in Germany, Austria, and the Balkans. At the same time, rival biker factions attempted to counterbalance his growing power. The Bandidos, longtime enemies of the Hells Angels, intensified recruitment in regions where Arabaci's associates had roots. Street-level disputes escalated into targeted attacks, clubhouses burned, and motorcycle parades became tactical displays rather than celebrations. Yet where others saw chaos, Arabaci saw an opportunity to reshape his influence quietly. He avoided the spotlight, never appearing at the scenes of these conflicts. Instead, he cultivated relationships with individuals positioned at the edges of multiple world security personnel, nightclub managers, Balkan traffickers, Turkish intermediaries, and loyal Hells Angels members with deep ties to Germany's organized crime markets. With these alliances, he mapped a new structure of loyalty that bypassed traditional biker hierarchies. Investigators struggled to understand how a man who could not legally enter Germany still controlled major leverage points across the country. Phone records provided only fragments. Controlled deliveries exposed only the lower tier of operations, and informants rarely offered more than speculation. His network did not function through meetings or written orders, but through unwritten expectations shaped by years of reputation and strategic positioning. Arrests, extradition battles, and the illusion of control. By the late 2020s, the hunt for Necati Arabaci stretched across multiple countries, yet every attempt to capture and contain him seemed to dissolve as soon as it began. Authorities across Europe were convinced that bringing him into custody would disrupt a major source of criminal coordination. But each arrest only proved how deeply the system underestimated his insulation, his network, and the unique shield afforded to him by geography and nationality. The first major turning point came in 2015, when Spanish authorities issued a European Union-wide arrest warrant accusing him of extortion, human trafficking, and narcotics coordination. Their investigation linked him indirectly to operations that moved across Germany, Spain, and the Netherlands. But even as the warrant spread across borders, it hit a wall the moment it reached Turkey. No matter how serious the allegations, Turkey does not extradite its citizens. And Arabaci was not only a Turkish national, but a man who had woven deep connections into the social fabric of the country's criminal and economic spheres. This legal shield turned him into a ghost visible on paper, but unreachable in practice. Interpol notices circulated, partnerships between German, Spanish, and Dutch investigators intensified. Yet every effort came back to the same problem. They could locate him, monitor him, track his movements, but they could not touch him. He lived in Izmir with the kind of calm confidence only possible when law enforcement's reach ends at a country's border. But that didn't mean Turkey ignored him. In June 2018, Turkish authorities arrested him on suspicion of criminal association and trafficking-related offenses. The news spread quickly across Europe, sparking speculation that Turkey might finally crack the protective shell around him. Investigators in Germany hoped this meant he could be held long enough for European partners to build a stronger case. Instead, he was released just 3 months later due to insufficient evidence. The brief detention only reinforced his status as a figure whose influence exceeded the capacity of any single government to contain. Authorities found themselves confronting a paradox. They had enough evidence to support international investigations, but not enough to imprison him within the only country that could legally hold him. 2 years later, in July 2020, he was arrested again. Another wave of optimism followed the news. Perhaps this time the charges would hold. Perhaps this time, European investigators would be able to provide the levels of documentation Turkey required. Yet once again, the case fell apart. After a short period of detention, he was released. No long trial, no chain of witnesses. Nothing that could anchor him in a courtroom. Life in the shadows, rebuilding, reinventing, and ruling from afar. From the outside, it appeared as if Necati Arabaci had vanished. No more street confrontations, no more public displays of power, no more nightclub sightings or tabloid scandals. After years of chaos in Germany, arrest warrants in Spain, and investigations across multiple countries, he retreated into the quiet landscape of Turkey. But the silence surrounding him was not surrender. It was a strategy, a new phase in which power was exercised without being seen. Izmir became the backdrop for a life designed to look ordinary. He avoided public conflict, lived discreetly, and surrounded himself with stability rather than spectacle. To casual observers, he appeared as a man slowing down, perhaps aging out of the world he once dominated. But within Europe's criminal circles, the perception was very different. The quieter he became, the more they believed he was still pulling strings. Silence, in his case, was interpreted as authority. Over the years, Arabaci shifted from an operational leader to a symbolic one, a man whose name alone could settle disputes or initiate cooperation. He no longer needed to walk through Germany's red light districts to command attention. His decades of influence had built something far more valuable, a legacy people still acted upon. Younger members of the Hells Angels in Turkey viewed him as both a founding reference point and an elder statesman. Older members across Europe remembered him as a man who shaped the power map in Cologne during a time when gang wars, brothel empires, and street violence defined the region. But what kept him relevant was not nostalgia, it was structure. Arabaci maintained links not through direct action, but through trusted intermediaries. Individuals who owed their careers to him. Individuals whose incomes depended on networks he had built. Individuals who still turned to him for guidance when territorial lines shifted or alliances came under threat. This form of remote leadership became his greatest adaptation. By removing himself from daily criminal activity, he reduced his exposure while maintaining influence through those who continued to operate openly. This model was particularly effective in Turkey, where the Hells Angels Nomads chapter played a unique role in the region. It functioned as a strategic node between Europe, the Middle East, and trafficking routes stretching from Central Asia into Western markets. Arabaci's presence in Izmir placed him at the edge of these movements. He did not need to be involved directly to benefit from their structure. The networks had been built long before, and he remained the person many believed understood them best. Meanwhile, his image shifted. He became less the feared enforcer who controlled brothels through intimidation and more a figure described as cautious, calculating, and quietly influential. He had transitioned into the type of criminal leader who no longer needed to prove himself physically. His danger now came from longevity, memory, and reach. Yet this quieter life did not erase the shadow of his past. European law enforcement agencies continued to track him, often citing him in reports as a person of interest, despite not being able to touch him legally. German authorities monitored his associates. Spanish investigators kept open files referencing his role in earlier cross-border operations. Turkish police remained aware of his presence, even if evidence against him remained too thin to anchor a long-term case. For Arabaci, survival was not luck, it was adaptation. He had learned to operate in a changing criminal world where visible leadership attracted surveillance and invisibility offered security. His life in Turkey became a careful balance between maintaining influence and avoiding vulnerability. In the end, he did not disappear. He simply changed form, not the street boss, not the brothel king, not the Cologne enforcer, but a strategist in the shadows, shaping events he never had to be physically present for. His empire had shifted, but it had never died. Legacy of fear and influence. How Arabaci's name became currency. In organized crime, power usually fades when a leader loses territory, freedom, or visibility. Yet Necati Arabaci defied this pattern. His power did not diminish with deportation. His influence did not collapse when Germany expelled him. Instead, his reputation became something more formidable than control over streets or brothels. His name became a form of currency. Across Europe, within both criminal and law enforcement circles, the name Necati Arabaci triggered a specific reaction. In the criminal world, it symbolized authority and experience. To the police, it represented an unresolved threat, a figure who had repeatedly slipped through legal systems without ever disappearing. Even those who never met him directly had heard stories of his control over Cologne's red light district, his rumored connections to international trafficking routes, and his ability to influence events from hundreds of kilometers away. Reputation became his strongest weapon. It traveled faster than orders, spread wider than his physical presence, and shaped decisions long after he had relocated to Turkey. Younger Hells Angels members who grew up hearing about his operations in Germany treated his legacy as a blueprint. They saw him as the example of how far influence could extend if managed with discipline, alliances, and strategic invisibility. Older members recognized him as one of the rare figures who managed to survive multiple eras of biker politics without being killed, imprisoned for life, or pushed into irrelevance. This reverence generated a unique form of power. People acted in ways they believed he would approve of, even without direct instruction. They avoided touching certain territories because of old arrangements tied to him. They treated certain business networks as off-limits, even years after his physical departure. His name enforced boundaries in the same way physical presence once had. Even outside the biker world, his influence crept into unexpected places. In 2018, prosecutors in Ottawa encountered a disturbing case. Two women had been extorted and assaulted by a man who falsely claimed to be a Hells Angels Nomads member. His entire ability to control them hinged on one thing: a claimed connection to Arabaci. The women believed him because the name carried weight far beyond criminal circles. It carried myth, fear, and an unspoken threat built on decades of violent reputation. Law enforcement officials who investigated Arabaci understood this dynamic clearly. They wrote in their reports that his power extended beyond his actions. His legacy functioned as a deterrent. They noted how small-time criminals invoked his name to elevate themselves, how rival gangs maneuvered cautiously in territories where his associates had roots, how former employees at brothels, once connected to him, still used his name to reinforce authority or intimidate competition. This was the kind of influence impossible to measure on paper. There were no financial statements showing its value, no wiretaps documenting its full reach, no arrests that could dismantle it. Reputation lived in the air, passed through prison corridors, whispered in biker clubhouses, retold over drinks in red light districts, and woven into the stories of younger criminals eager to replicate the success of a man who remained permanently out of reach. But reputation also carried a darker meaning. For law enforcement, his name symbolized a failure to truly dismantle a criminal structure. Every time an investigation referenced him without an indictment, his legend deepened. Every attempted extradition blocked by Turkish law strengthened the image of untouchability. Every released suspect, linked back to him, reinforced the idea that he moved beyond jurisdictional limits. In the criminal world, fear and respect are often intertwined. Arabaci's legacy embodied both. He represented survival in a landscape where most leaders fall. He represented durability in a world where alliances change overnight. And he represented the unsettling truth that sometimes the most powerful criminals are the ones you can identify clearly but cannot reach at all. Over time, his name became more than history. It became a symbol, a lesson, a warning, a reminder that in the shadows of Europe's underworld, influence is not just earned, it's inherited by reputation, cemented by survival, and carried long after the man himself steps out of view. A network without borders, Arabaci's transnational web of criminal influence. Long before authorities realized what he had built, Necati Arabaci had already woven a network that ignored borders, legal systems, and national jurisdictions. His ability to operate across continents did not come from physical movement, something he could no longer risk after deportation, but from a carefully layered structure of intermediaries, alliances, and business fronts that made geography irrelevant. What began as a Cologne-centered empire evolved into a transnational system capable of functioning with or without his direct presence. The foundation of this network was laid during his years in Germany. By controlling brothels, security crews, and nightclub territories, Arabaci established financial channels that moved quietly through cash-based businesses. These channels later became the backbone of broader European operations. When he relocated to Turkey, those routes remained active because they had never relied on a single location. They relied on people-trusted lieutenants who understood his methods and benefited from maintaining them. From Izmir, he became a nodal point in a system that stretched from Western Europe to the gateway regions of the Middle East. Turkey provided a strategic advantage. Positioned near narcotics routes coming from Afghanistan and Iran, it allowed him proximity to networks that fed Europe's heroin markets. Investigators noted that Turkish ports, trucking companies, and migrant smuggling corridors frequently intersected with organizations tied to biker gangs and Balkan criminal alliances. Arabaci did not need to physically supervise these routes. His name and his associates were enough to keep the flow steady. Germany remained the most critical European hub. Cities like Cologne, Hamburg, and Frankfurt sat at the crossroads of trafficking lines. Even after his deportation, remnants of his original organization continued to operate in these regions. Safe houses, informal money transfer networks, and brothel-linked cash businesses ensured continuity. These structures were difficult to dismantle because they were not registered on paper. They existed through loyalty, debt, and shared interest. Beyond Germany, Spain emerged as a secondary node. The Costa del Sol, long known as Europe's Costa del Crime, served as a refuge for criminals fleeing northern European investigations. When Spanish authorities intensified operations against biker-linked groups, they repeatedly encountered individuals with known connections to Arabaci's old network. These were not direct subordinates, but people whose incomes or protection once depended on systems he had created. Even years after his departure, they continued to replicate his style of organization. Small, decentralized units capable of operating independently while maintaining loose allegiance to a shared past. Meanwhile, Balkan countries, especially Albania, Serbia, and North Macedonia, played roles in the movement of arms, drugs, and forged documents. These regions were fertile ground for alliances. Their criminal groups valued reliability over hierarchy, making them ideal collaborators for a figure like Arabaci, who could offer consistency without demanding rigid loyalty. Through these intermediaries, the Hells Angels maintained access to underworld services that strengthened their position in Europe's shifting criminal landscape. What made Arabaci's network so resistant to law enforcement disruption was its fluidity. No single component was essential. If one brothel closed, another opened under a different name. If a trafficking route tightened, intermediaries adjusted paths through neighboring regions. If authorities investigated a known associate, another contact stepped into their role seamlessly. This adaptability came from years of strategic planning, designing systems meant to outlive raids, arrests, and political shifts. Turkey became the anchor not for operational activity, but for safety. From there, he could observe Europe's underworld like a strategist studying a battlefield. He understood which alliances mattered. He understood how biker clubs functioned across borders, and he understood that influence, not presence, was the real currency of survival. In the end, Arabaci's network represented a modern form of criminal architecture, decentralized, resilient, and international. It did not collapse when he left Germany. It expanded. It did not weaken under pressure. It adapted. It did not rely on territory. It relied on relationships. And in that design, Arabaci created something few criminals ever achieve: a system capable of outliving the man who built it. Rivalries, retaliations, and the shadow wars of Germany's underworld. Long before his name echoed across Europe, Necati Arabaci learned a truth that defined his rise. Power in the underworld is never truly taken. It is defended, contested, and constantly threatened. Nowhere was this more evident than in the shadow wars that unfolded across Germany as rival groups tried to challenge his influence or carve out territory in regions he dominated. These conflicts shaped his leadership style, hardened his circle, and transformed him from a street-level figure into a strategist navigating dangerous rivalries. Germany's criminal landscape was a patchwork of competing interests long before Arabaci arrived. The Hells Angels had established chapters in major cities, but they constantly clashed with organizations like the Bandidos, Satudara, United Tribunes, Ottoman Germania, and various Balkan groups. Into this volatile mix stepped Arabaci, whose control of Cologne's red light districts made him a direct obstacle to nearly every other gang with territorial ambitions. The Satudara MC, known for its diverse membership and rapid expansion, became one of the most aggressive challengers. They pushed into North Rhine-Westphalia, attempting to take over nightlife security and prostitution markets. As Satudara grew, pressure on Hells Angels locations intensified. Bars, brothels, and clubs became battlegrounds where influence was measured not by numbers, but by who could hold a street, intimidate competitors, or enforce agreements without hesitation. Arabaci responded not with open warfare, but with calculated pressure. His approach relied on enforcing dominance through strategic alliances, the threat of retaliation, and the reputation of his crew. Rivals who tested boundaries often found their businesses disrupted or their key players suddenly unwilling to continue disputes. The message was unmistakable: any challenge would be costly. The United Tribunes presented a more complex dynamic. While they had their own power base and ambitions, their conflicts with Arabaci's network were often intertwined with shifting alliances and temporary agreements. In some periods, they acted as rivals vying for territory. In others, they functioned as strategic partners against mutual threats like Satudara or regional street gangs. These fluctuating relationships showed Arabaci's ability to navigate hostility and cooperation simultaneously, a skill that allowed him to remain influential even when surrounded by enemies. Yet the most significant rivalry was with authorities, not other gangs. Law enforcement, recognizing his expanding control, orchestrated continuous raids and surveillance operations. Every rival group he neutralized made the police more determined to dismantle his operations. Ironically, police investigations often strengthened his position. When weaker competitors fell under pressure, Arabaci's network absorbed their territories through intermediaries, maintaining control even when he was physically absent. The brutality of the era was undeniable. Drive-by shootings, firebombings, street assaults, and ambushes became part of the landscape as biker clubs and street gangs fought their shadow wars. Many conflicts never made headlines, handled quietly between factions to avoid drawing excessive heat. Other incidents erupted publicly, triggering national debates on outlaw motorcycle gangs and prompting calls for harsher legislation. Throughout these turbulent years, Arabaci remained a central figure, not always visible, but always influential. His importance to the Hells Angels lay not only in his business holdings, but in his ability to maintain stability in territories where constant conflict threatened profits. He understood that open warfare consumed resources, damaged networks, and attracted law enforcement, so he relied instead on selective retaliation. Violence became a strategic tool, not a default reaction. When he was deported to Turkey, many believed his absence would weaken the Cologne faction. Instead, the opposite occurred. Without him physically present, the network he helped shape relied on the systems of intimidation, negotiation, and territorial control he had established. Rivals continued to treat his territories cautiously, knowing the structures remained intact, even if the man behind them was gone. These shadow wars revealed the nature of Arabaci's power. He did not rule through chaos. He ruled through controlled danger, knowing when to escalate, when to negotiate, and when to disappear. And in the violent world of German organized crime, that strategy ensured he survived battles that destroyed many others. The Empire from Exile: Power, Protection, and Reinvention in Turkey. When Necati Arabaci was deported to Turkey, many expected his power to collapse under the weight of distance. The assumption was simple: a man removed from his territory loses control. Yet in Arabaci's case, exile became an advantage, not a setback. Turkey offered safety, strategic geography, and a base of operations far from European law enforcement. From Izmir, he reinvented himself, turning forced relocation into a platform for broader influence. Turkey served as a natural shield. As a Turkish citizen, he could not be extradited to Germany or Spain, regardless of new investigations or arrest warrants circulating through Europe. To international agencies, he became a ghost operating behind a protective layer of national policy. This transformed him into a figure who could maneuver with far fewer risks than the enemies or rivals he once contended with on German soil. For him, Turkey was not an endpoint. It was a recalibration of power. The Hells Angels Nomads Turkey chapter became the foundation of his new presence. Unlike territorial chapters tied to specific cities, a Nomads chapter offers freedom of operation, mobility, and heightened status. It was a symbolic and strategic move. From this position, Arabaci could maintain communication with European associates, receive updates on financial flows, and influence decisions affecting key criminal markets. He no longer dealt with frontline disputes. Instead, he oversaw the architecture of networks he once led directly. Turkey's position between Europe and the Middle East created opportunities. Trade routes, migrant pathways, and narcotics corridors intersect with local criminal networks, providing potential partnerships for anyone with experience and connections. Arabaci's background in brothels, extortion, and biker-linked operations translated easily into new forms of influence. He could facilitate introductions, broker relationships, or smooth conflicts between groups that needed an intermediary who understood both European biker politics and Turkish underworld structures. Back in Europe, his absence did not create a vacuum. Instead, it forced his old network to adapt. Trusted lieutenants assumed management roles, brothels continued operations, and criminal alliances endured through shared profits rather than direct orders. Arabaci's strength had always been his ability to build systems that could endure pressure. These systems, cash-based businesses, biker alliances, and intimidation-driven enforcement, continued functioning because they were designed to operate with decentralization in mind. Even when police raided properties or arrested associates, new faces emerged to take the roles of those removed. In Turkey, Arabaci learned the value of invisibility. The flamboyance of his early years gave way to a quieter approach focused on influence rather than public dominance. He maintained a low profile, avoided unnecessary media exposure, and allowed rumors to do the work of intimidation for him. Even individuals who had never met him treated his legacy as a blueprint for a cross-border organization. Exile did not diminish him, it transformed him. From Turkey, he operated like a strategist rather than a soldier, observing, guiding, and intervening only when necessary. He no longer lived in the spotlight of Cologne's nightlife or the scrutiny of German investigators. Instead, he controlled a quieter empire built on reputation, connections, and the knowledge that power is most effective when exercised from the shadows. Legacy of a Ghost, Fear, Myth, and the Unfinished Story of Necati Arabaci. By the time he entered his 50s, Necati Arabaci had become something rare in the world of organized crime, a man who survived long enough to watch his own legend grow. Most figures of his rank end up dead, imprisoned for life, or consumed by internal betrayal. Arabaci managed to avoid all three outcomes, and in doing so, created a legacy that continues to ripple through Germany, Turkey, and the broader European underworld. His influence became less about visible action and more about what people believed he was capable of. The myth began in Cologne, where his early years as a bouncer, enforcer, and brothel operator shaped the city's nightlife economy. For many, he represented the brutal efficiency required to dominate a lucrative but dangerous market. His methods, structured violence, financial discipline, and calculated alliances set the standard for the next generation of power players. Even after his deportation, people inside that world continued to follow the rules he established long after he stopped enforcing them personally. Over time, his name became a symbol. Rivals used it to frighten competitors. Associates used it to strengthen negotiations. Police used it to explain the persistence of organized networks, even when key figures disappeared. This was the strange duality of his legacy. He was both absent and omnipresent, physically distant but psychologically central. His legend operated as a form of pressure, turning rumor into a weapon more potent than any direct threat. For law enforcement, Arabaci represented the frustration of battling criminals who learned how to exploit borders. He embodied the challenges of globalized crime networks that extend beyond jurisdiction, members who operate in multiple countries, and leaders protected by citizenship laws and political complications. Investigators in Germany, Spain, and the Netherlands spent years trying to dismantle leftover pieces of his empire, but the decentralized nature of his systems made destruction impossible. Every time a brothel shut down or a crew was arrested, another surfaced under new management with the same structure and methods. For the Hells Angels, his legacy carried a different weight. He was not only a businessman, but an example of how a member could leverage the club's influence to build personal power far beyond traditional biker operations. Arabaci showed that the Hells Angels could evolve from street-level dominance into multinational coordination, blending outlaw biker culture with modern criminal strategy. His position within the Nomads chapter of Turkey gave him status unmatched by most European members, turning him into a bridge between the biker world and the Turkish underworld. His influence also had a cultural dimension. Within outlaw circles, he became an emblem of survival, someone who outmaneuvered police task forces, escaped years of investigations, and rebuilt his empire from another country. For younger criminals, his story served as a blueprint for cross-border operations. For older figures, it was a reminder that adaptability meant longevity. Yet his legacy is also marked by unresolved mysteries. Questions linger about the full extent of his financial network, the identities of the lieutenants who continued running his businesses, and the alliances he maintained behind the scenes. Some believe he slowly shifted towards semi-legitimate ventures to protect his future. Others insist he still influences criminal markets from the quiet neighborhoods of Izmir. The truth sits somewhere between myth and reality, blurred by silence, protected by loyalty, and complicated by time. What remains undeniable is that Arabaci represents a chapter in European organized crime that still hasn't closed. His story did not end with exile, retirement, or prison. It continues through the systems he built, the fear his name evokes, and the lessons he taught an entire generation of underworld figures. His life demonstrates how a single individual can reshape criminal landscapes not by constant violence, but by strategic reinvention and the ability to remain untouchable.